So why in the Middle East did they fall so far behind with a strong merchant background? Well, the argument that Timur Kuran makes is in Islamic law. Islamic law held things back, particularly inheritance law. You know, when somebody dies, his property has to be immediately divided to his heirs, and you can't do that when you're in a corporation. Basically, the argument is the legal system that used to develop, progress through leaders in Islamic culture who were businessmen, later became decided by church people who didn't have business experience. Basically, things fell behind. So Islamic businesses couldn't raise money, they couldn't advance. And also there's a problem of Islam being the church and the state in the same person. This is very much the problem in Spain under the Spanish Empire, where the Spanish king was a devout Christian, but also ran an empire. It's a problem in Russia, where the Tsar is the head of the church, as well as the head of the country. And, you know, religion and power don't mix. So separating church and state, which we had in the West, helped in economic development. And decentralizing power, where we had hundreds of different political entities in Western Europe, that meant if your government was no good, you could, you know, move down the street and go to another one. Does that make sense? Again, another deep, dark book. You can find the discussions with Quran online. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it helps understand. Because the problem the Islamic people have, the Muslims have, is they were this shining civilization in the sense of prosperity, you know, beautiful fountains, leading scientists, all this sort of stuff. They were this leading civilization, and now they're not. Now they're wandering around with donkeys, you know. And so why have they fallen behind? Well, maybe because the West held them down, maybe because the Crusades and the New Crusades. But separately, you could say, well, this helps explain the problem. Yeah.
I don't know if I missed it, but how big of a problem would you say that the Mongol conquest in 13 or 14?
Well, yeah, big problem. Big problem all through, right? Big problem in Europe. And, you know, the Crusaders, you know, the Muslim conqueror coming into the Middle East was a Christian, right? And was allied with the Crusaders to go after the Islamic. It's a sort of bizarre world. But yeah, huge problem. All those, you know, the cataclysms of all these places are significant. I think the thing to remember, the thing to think about is, you know, just World War II. We bombed Japan flat. We bombed Germany flat. Tremendous disaster throughout all of Europe, not just the Middle East. And yet, Japan and Germany are incredibly prosperous countries a couple decades later. So there's all these turmoils that devastate things in the past, but the question is, why have some countries in the Middle East not been able to respond? And Turkey, by the way, is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Dubai probably is the fastest growing economy. So some Islamic countries have done fine. Yeah.
Has the Islamic inheritance law, has it had any effect on property rights? Has it caused the lack of property rights, or is it simply having to do with business strategy and those who administer large enterprises?
I guess I'd refer you to the book and the discussions for more. It's just one aspect. You know, a key thing is when you know, a big corporation, the main guy can die, and then the company is taken over by others, is heirs own stock and so forth. But people dying doesn't disrupt, I mean, it does disrupt companies. You know, Steve Jobs died and so forth. But you don't have to split up the country and break it all apart. So the key is, somebody said, you know, we need to raise $10 million to launch this trading venture, and you couldn't raise that in Islamic countries. You couldn't get that money together because you couldn't have 500 people putting a little bit of money there. So there's more to that story, but the ability to raise capital. I mean, why did Holland take over, Netherlands take over? Well, part of it is they had the first stock markets. They had ways to dramatically raise money, country run by merchants. And so those sorts of things, you know, are what economic historians look at as this background. Yeah. Oh, yes, sorry. You're out of my field of vision here, so I can't.
So is there a point in history that you could point to, maybe you could tell us that theocracies were kind of rendered economically obsolete, or was it kind of a gradual advance of modern technology and trade?
I think the way I'd look at it is theocracies, you know, the rest of these countries of the world operate the same way as they used to. There's like, no, they're in a sense they're okay. They're bad news, but governments have always been bad news when they have arbitrary authority. What changed is the sort of the economic freedom in Western Europe. And by the way, there's another way to look at this is the ancient Greeks. When you study the ancient world, you tend to study about these ancient Greek city-states that were always squabbling. They're always battling each other. And then came Alexander and united everybody, and then the Roman Empire. But the economic historian way to look at it is Alexander and the Roman Empire slowed development. Development was fastest during the Greek city-states. You had 50, 80, 100 different colonies and cities. They were all competing. They were trading. There were wars, but they were more pitched battles that last a day or two. You had stunning economic progress during the time of the ancient Greek city-states. In fact, city-states were the prosperity for Europe. The Hanseatic League, Genoa, Venice, these were all city-states, and they worked, in a sense, better than nations. So this story we have of the nation states being the source, it's sort of backwards. It's more cities that are prosperous. So having charter cities, startup cities, Hong Kong, Singapore as examples of prosperity. Yeah.
In the age when the Muslim empires were huge, a lot of their prosperity came from China to the Silk Road, right? And so what happened was the Europeans, the Portuguese developed a way of sailing around Africa and finding a different way of supplying from China to Europe, that type of trade. How much do you think that played into the downfall of the empires and the prosperity?
It was huge. It was huge. Because, and not only that, I mean, a big part of the Western economic development wasn't just the economic freedom, it was trade with the New World. The trade with the New World was stunning. All the prosperity comes in these Western European cities that are trading with the New World. So there's a lot part of that. But the bigger story, the story is, yes, it was a huge hit for the Middle East. The challenge is they didn't respond to it the way they could have. Right? The challenge is when you get a society that's sort of frozen and, they're making their money one way, you keep doing the same thing. So it was more that they couldn't respond and change. But yeah, you get a lot of your money from one thing, and then like Dubai, Dubai was basically a charter city run by the British in a sense, with a British charter making its money on pearl diving and trade. Then came artificial pearls, and they're sort of stuck. They're involved in commerce. Then they discover oil. All of a sudden, everything's transformed. They've got all this oil. Then they discover they're going to run out of oil, that the oil is not going to allow them to continue to prosper. They could have just declined and lived off the oil until it went away. Instead, they said, okay, let's have a complete sort of free city. No taxes, no import restrictions. Anybody can live here. The main thing is you can't vote, right? Because they don't want, the 2 million Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis voting. So instead they're there and work. But that is their response, institutional response to changing economic circumstances. And back to your question on what changed, any particular date that changed, I don't have a good answer for that. I think, sort of a gradual process. There's fascinating when you read the history. This history is just totally fascinating. Rodney Stark writes on this. He's very controversial in his criticism of Islamic countries and the backwardness of them. And he's got a book on the Crusades, how great the Crusades were. Needless to say, that's controversial. But it's interesting in, taking another look at that whole story. So this is a story, article now about the West. Now, how are we time-wise? I know at some point I need to take a break. Should we take a 10-minute break, 5-minute break? Yeah. I'll warn you out at 8 in the morning. So let's take a break for a few minutes, and then we'll go on again.